Welcome to another episode of Incite Your Month. It's our monthly collection of recommendations from all of us at Choose to Think, whether it be books, articles, or podcast episodes. As usual, I have Harish with me. So, Harish, we have a very brainy episode this time. Let me kick it off with our pick for book of the month, and it's a book called Brain Rules. In fact, we created a book summary infographic long back when we were creating our first Choose to Think calendar. These are ideas that have gone through scientific rigor and the principles that all of us can use to understand our brain better. So, talks a lot about memory, attention, how everyone's brain is wired differently. Even if you have a twin sibling, you go in very different directions because of how the brain develops. And I think very importantly for anyone who's trying to get better, either learning themselves or helping others get better, understanding some of these brain rules tells you how to approach these problems of change, of learning, because all of us ultimately are dependent on this little mass of gray matter to perform in that particular fashion. And with that, let's talk about our article of the month. It's not really an article.
Yeah, it's a Twitter thread and it's by a person whose name is Jean Michael Lemieux. Not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but his Twitter handle is at JMWIND. Highly recommend you to follow him. So this particular Twitter thread is about alignment. Right. It's a very interesting one because he talks about how people, they generally say that just hire the best people and let them be, don't come in their way. That's the best way of management. And any kind of checking in is considered to be micro these days. So that he has a different take on it. What he says is usually people align at the why level and the how and what are left for people to figure out and do it in their own way. He says aligning doesn't necessarily mean micromanagement, right? The more you communicate with people, the more you are aligned on the what and how. Things are actually good because you, with your years of experience or a better, more deeply thought out take on the same thing, are going to be able to add value, which you should do. So the idea is not to micromanage, but definitely be aligned. I think in the last few years, people have taken this autonomy to a different kind of an extreme where they've said, yeah, autonomy means just leave people to do whatever they want. I think the key word to use there is alignment. So that was a very interesting one, I thought, in the realm of how work is being done these days in organizations, right?
Like you said, it tells people that it's okay to come and suggest a few things. It's okay to try and reduce that gap of alignment. And by doing that, you're doing what is right for everyone. So from that thread, let's move ahead to our Smartcast picks. A Smartcast is Choose to Think's own series of podcasts. We've spoken to a wide variety of interesting people over the last year. Who do we have lined up this time, Harish?
Yeah, so this was a very interesting episode that I did with Nirant Kasliwal. So I had actually posted on Twitter asking for recommendations, and somebody said, "I want to listen about how Nirant wrote a book on natural language processing and machine learning at a very young age." And I wrote to him, connected with him, and he agreed to do the Smartcast. So when I started talking about doing the Smartcast, it was more about just trying to figure out how he wrote the book. And I assumed that he would have got a lot of benefit and social capital out of writing the book. I spoke to him about this, and I was also disabused of some of my opinions because what he told me was that yeah, book might probably be a door opener, but a lot of people in India apparently, at least, or who are trying to recruit, don't really care about the fact that he's written a book. So then the conversation actually went into other aspects like what should people look at when being hired for engineering roles, and how can engineering students try to work backwards in terms of figuring out where they want to go and what do they need to actually then add to their quiver of arrows to be able to get there. Very interesting episode that we did with someone from that demographic, right? That there was clearly 10 to 15 years of age difference between us. So, a lot of eye opening ideas for me. And Nirant has given some very interesting tactics to use while interviewing with a company, just to get a sense of the culture of the company and what you should look for. So I would highly recommend that. It is also a good mirror for founders and people who are running companies like this, because they're going and hiring people like Nirant, so they ought to know what they really think about in the workplace.
I think in some sense, some companies are becoming more irrelevant because of these old conventional hiring practices, and people like Nirant are probably going to just not pay attention to you if you don't have hiring practices that match their expectations. So that's an interesting one, Harish. All right, so let's switch gears back to the world of audio, and we'll talk about our podcast selection for the month. And this can be seen as a bit of a follow up to our Brain Rules selection. This is an episode on EconTalk, one of the oldest, most popular podcasts around. And the guest on this episode is called Luca Dellanna, who's written a book called The Control Heuristic. And it's really about understanding the brain. And he's a management consultant. He actually helps companies with anti-fragility, being resilient and anti-fragile. He's actually studied brain behavior, and a very interesting concept that he brings forth in the episode and presumably in the book is that typically we think of the brain using metaphors, right? One popular metaphor, it's like a computer. And I'm sure earlier in time it would have been seen as a calculator. Delano looks at the brain as, like a company. He says that just like in a company, there are different employees. They have access to partial information, and everyone tries to do their best with that information and tries to take decisions and actions that they think is in the interest of the company using that particular information. And that's a good way to think of the brain, because we have different regions in our brain that don't always communicate with each other. They take inputs and outputs from each other, but then sometimes the regions have to make their best guess as to why something has happened before. And that's why it's like the employees in a company. In some sense, your emotional brain will react to something, and your analytical brain becomes like the PR man. You have to explain to the conscious side as to why I am acting in this particular way. What he rightly points out is that sometimes it is just a guess and it is just self delusion. And what it really does is that it tells you some of the approaches that you can take when you are changing behavior. What can you really do when you are trying to influence people? And a lot of interesting ideas. It talks about why diversity is so important in a group of humans. So, great episode. I would encourage people to listen to that episode, Harish.
Yeah, I think somebody had mentioned to us that when we are helping companies build their culture manifesto and align people on their culture, it is like the mindfulness for the company. So I
Nice.
guess in this case, if you think of it, mindfulness for the brain is going to be the alignment that we spoke about earlier as well. Make sure every member of the company inside your head is aligned. I think that's.
Okay, so with that, let's go to our final section for today, which is the smart lever of the month. So the smart lever, think of it as an interesting mental model that you can use to uplevel yourself. So what have you chosen this time?
Yeah, this comes from the book The Power of Moments, and this is the epic framework. The epic framework basically is a framework that you can apply to understand why some moments are more memorable than others, right? And epic stands for elevation, pride, insight, and some kind of connection. So if you think of the kind of things that we share in our monthly recommendations, right? These are typically those which are memorable for us across the huge curiosity diet that we have of our own. But there's some insight that we have gained, like the ones that we have just shared. So those are the ones that remain in our minds, and actually you will perfectly understand this when I say that you would also probably remember the whole setting when that insight came to you, right? When you were listening to the podcast, where you were, what you were doing, which vessel were you washing, or which piece of cloth you were folding. All that will come rushing to your mind when you remember any of the picks that we make, because you've had some kind of an insight there. Think of other such memorable moments where a regular moment has got elevated, or there's some feeling of pride because you have done something great, or there's some form of connection because you did something as a group. So I would highly recommend people to listen to that.
And just to give a sneak peek, one of the areas that this can be very directly applicable is when you're designing something like an onboarding program for new employees. Because you really want them to have that sense of having a great memorable moment when they first enter. But I think what people miss is that while they're directing their attention to these new folks, it's almost like welcoming a son-in-law into the house. They forget about the people already at home, and that's another place to use your power of moments. So check out our episode on the epic model and make that moment very memorable for everyone. So with that, it's time to say goodbye for this episode. We'll come back to you next month with another roundup of interesting links and recommendations. Thank you so much. Thanks, Harish.
Thanks, Ramanand.